It is a little bit past time to begin, but we'll go ahead and begin. Let's start with the word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study. Thank you for the moisture that we've been receiving in this dry area, and just pray that you be with those who are sick or struggling in whatever way and are unable to be with us, and just be with those who are suffering loss at this time, as we do know there are those that are suffering loss at this time, and just pray that we turn to you for comfort and strength in all times. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Let's be open up to Isaiah chapter 1. We're going to be looking there, then moving to another chapter. But Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9 is what I want to just spend a little bit of time with, because it helps introduce what we're going to be talking about today. But Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9 says, "Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah." Now, we touched on that verse briefly last time. What is it telling us about or what is verse 9? What's the idea there, is what I'm trying to say. I can hear the crickets. Okay. Okay, so there are, so Sodom and Gomorrah completely destroyed, all its people gone. And then, as Elaine was just alluding to, there were some people left over from the destruction that came with God's judgment on his people. Now, with that in mind, in other words, God did allow some of his people to survive his judgment, and these survivors that this verse touches on is what the book of Isaiah calls the remnant. Now, can anyone tell me what that word remnant means?
Like a small portion of what was once existed, a whole.
Okay, so yes, that is the idea here. Is you have a whole, but then the remnant is something that is left over. Now, just a silly example, maybe you enjoyed some pie or cake over the holidays. You didn't eat all of it. What's left over is known as the remnants. Now, the Oxford Dictionary definition that I came across calls it a small minority of people who will remain. A small part of something that's left over. In a biblical sense, it's a small minority of people who will remain faithful to God and be saved. So you have all of God's people, but then not all of God's people remain faithful to God. Those who remain faithful are the remnant. But this is one of the other major themes of Isaiah, is this theme of the remnant. And we're going to be spending time looking at this theme from the text of Isaiah chapter 4. But is there anything else on this verse before we move forward? All right. So again, Isaiah 1 verse 9 introduces what we're going to be looking at in Isaiah chapter 4. So if you'll be turning with me to that chapter, that's where we'll spend the rest of our time. Again, that's Isaiah chapter 4. Now, Isaiah chapter 4 is one of the shorter chapters in Isaiah. And in this chapter, what we find here are 2 points about the remnant of God's people and the condition they would be in after they would go through the judgment that God would bring upon his people. So again, there's 2 points. The first point we find in verses 1 through 3 is that the remnant would be called holy. And the second point we find in verses 4 through 6 is that the remnant would be cleansed. Now, after looking at these points, what we will learn is that we must strive to be a part of God's remnant, because even today, you have the whole church, but the sad reality is that not everybody in the church is going to continue to faithfully serve God with all the difficulties that are coming. So, and part of the reason for that is because we live in a world that is not serving God. And so faithfulness to God does become difficult. But we'll talk about that more when we get to the application of this text. But let's start by reading through chapter 4, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Isaiah 4, at the beginning of the chapter, the text says, "For 7 women will take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. It will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning, then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory will be a canopy. There will be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day, and refuge and protection from the storm and the rain." So again, we're looking at this idea of the remnant, and the first point we'll look at is that they would be called holy. But this point is introduced with Isaiah making a statement. He makes this statement that deals with 7 women taking hold of a man and say what Isaiah records them as saying in that verse. So we have the phrase, "that day." Now, when we run into that phrase in some context, we have to ask, well, what day is that talking about? That's when you begin to look at context. That day points back, in this context, back to chapter 3. But what is the picture being drawn here in verse 1? There'll be fewer men. And what did you say, Dean? They'll take care of themselves. I'm glad you said that, Dean. But yes, there'll be fewer men. Now again, this goes back to chapter 3. Now something else we should understand here, with that in mind, what we should understand here is that what Isaiah described in chapter 3 was another message of God's judgment against his people. Now, among the words we find in that chapter, in verse 25, God said through Isaiah that Jewish men would fall by the sword and their mighty ones in battle. Now, applying that here, this should help us to understand that what Isaiah says here in verse 1 of chapter 4, it's not necessarily literal. There is some literalness to it, but it's not completely literal, but rather it's written figuratively and in pictures to say that these women, they're making a statement that Dean put very well, that these women would take care of themselves. But what are they asking this man in this statement? What do they want from him? But the text says, let us be called by what?
About his name. I mean, they're basically asking to not be, I don't know about married necessarily, but in a sense, because they're going to take his name.
Right.
They want to take it.
Yeah, it is marriage language, so it's not off point there. So they're saying, we're going to take care of ourselves, but here's one thing we want. We want your name. We want to remain married to you. Now, with that in mind, something else we should understand here is that what is said here recalls something we read in Exodus 21, verse 10. God, through Moses, said that if a man took for himself another wife, in addition to his first wife, he was not to reduce what she was entitled to as a wife. A man had to take care of his wife. I mean, that's still true today. But here, these women are saying, we'll take care of ourselves, but we still want to be married to you. And that's where this reproach idea comes in. Now, in the cultural context, if a woman wasn't married, that was a very shameful circumstance to be in. So these women, they want to remain married to this man, but they're telling this man, we'll take care of ourselves, but we just want your name. That's a lot of information. Questions or comments on verse 1?
Well, did they want children also?
The text doesn't say that, but that's probable.
Inferring that, although that's why I wondered if that, it doesn't say that, but what's their reproach?
The reproach would also include, I mean, we know from other Old Testament texts that if a woman didn't have children, that was also a shameful circumstance. So, but, yeah.
They felt it was
Right. That's true. Now, Isaiah doesn't address that here, but like you said, Don, we could maybe infer it. So, good point. Anything else on verse 1? Okay. So, having made that point, again, verse 1 kind of dovetails off chapter 3, but verse 2 begins to move forward. And Isaiah again uses the phrase, in that day, pointing back, and makes the point that this branch of the Lord would be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth would be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. So here's where we're running back into this survivors idea that we looked at in chapter 1. But the first thing that comes up in this verse is the branch of the Lord. This brings up a question we have to ask. We ask, well, who's this branch of the Lord? This branch of the Lord is an individual that we read about not only in Isaiah, but also in the books of Jeremiah and Zechariah, where he's described as being someone who would bring righteousness back to God's people. Since that's true, it was and still is believed that this person was and is the Jewish Messiah. Who's the Messiah? Jesus. So this is one of those texts that is called a messianic text that points forward to the person of Jesus. There's no reason not to believe that this is Jesus ultimately pointing toward. But here, Isaiah is making the point of what's going to happen when that branch of the Lord comes. According to the text, what's going to happen? It'll be beautiful and glorious. What else does the text say? Pride and honor for the survivors of Israel. Pride and honor for the remnant of Israel. So this refers to the fact that at the time God would bring his judgment, chapter 3, this branch of the Lord would become something attractive, meaning they'd be looking forward to that time when this branch of the Lord would come. And this fruit of the earth would become something that the survivors of Israel would be proud of. So another question we have to ask, well, what's this fruit of the earth? In context, this fruit of the earth would be the crops. When we see something growing, that's the fruit of the earth. One thing we know that happened during the judgment is the land was completely destroyed. But when this branch of the Lord comes, those crops would be restored. So this should help us to understand that what Isaiah says here paints the picture that even though God's people are going to go through some terrible things because of God's judgment, their situation would be reversed through this branch of the Lord that is the Messiah. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So verse 3. Isaiah goes on to say that it would come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem would be called holy, everyone who is recorded in the life in Jerusalem. So we have among the other words, well, first of all, before I go there, can anyone remind me what Zion is about, especially from our Lamentation studies? Okay, and where's the temple? In Jerusalem. What's that, Elaine? On a hill. Yes. So Zion is a reference of Jerusalem. And so we see Zion and Jerusalem paired together. But what are they going to be called? Holy. What's the word holy mean? Okay, dedicated to God. Any other ideas? Called out was also there. Set apart. So everything you guys said was correct, but the most literal definition for this is set apart. Who's going to be set apart? The remnant. But the remnant here in this verse is referred to as everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. Now what picture is that painting? Everyone who's recorded for life. Revelation. Now this isn't Revelation, but it does that same language. You have the tree of life is a different image, but over in Revelation you have the book of life. Same idea. So we have this word recorded for life, or this phrase recorded for life in Jerusalem. Now, when something is recorded, what does that mean? Written down. This is one reason we know this is that book of life kind of idea. It's like God has a book, and everyone who's going to have life, he's got their names written down in it. Again, this is figurative language, but it's making that point that these people are going to be called holy. Jeremiah, go ahead.
During the Old Testament time, only once a year were names written in the book of life, and in turn, your sins on the Day of Atonement every year when you sacrificed, your name was added to the book of life for the year, and all your sins were forgiven at that point. So for them, it's a very vital imagery of what they have to have. And the Jews today, Yom Kippur is the same thing. That on that day, every year, the book of life is sealed for the year, and it is very fun, the day that they believe every year that if you die and your name's not in it, you're not going to heaven.
There it is. So yes, the Jewish people, even more so than us, would understand this language. So, and yes, on the Day of Atonement, in the Jewish context, that's as Jeremiah put it, that's when that would happen. Your name would be written down. But here that's applied to God, God keeping track of these names, of who is going to be in Jerusalem after all this judgment happens. Any other questions or comments on verse 3? Good, Sandy. Not in this case. Seems to be talking about the crops. Because the text, if you read the verse together, it says, "In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel." So the fruit of the earth is the crops. Now you might be able to make some application very loosely to the fruit we're supposed to bear as Christians, but that's not what this is talking about. Elaine, go ahead. Yeah. Right. And I think Hebrews touches on that. Under the Old Testament, your sins had to be forgiven again and again and again. Yeah, rolled forward. But now with Jesus, they're forgiven once and for all. So. That's true. That's true, because a lot of people, even religious groups, are on that mindset, I have to do these things. Even Christians were guilty of that sometimes. I have to be baptized. You've heard me say this before. You have to be baptized. You have to put money in the plate. You have to take the Lord's Supper. This is what I need to do to be right with God. Now, those things are important. We need to do them, but it's not what it's about. It's not what we do that it's about. It's who we're following as we do those things. Again, you've heard me say that multiple times before, and you understand. Anything else on verse 3 or 2? Okay. So this is about the remnant. The point we should see from verses 1 through 3 about the remnant is that they would be called holy. They'd be a people set apart by God. Now, Isaiah has more specifically shown that this remnant would be a people that God has said would continue to live in Jerusalem through what he has figuratively written down. Now, since that's true, as we've already noticed, we could compare this statement to the New Testament perspective in Revelation, those who are in the book of life that would live eternally with God when this life is over. But that brings us into the second point in verses 4 through 6. For those who just walked in, we're in Isaiah chapter 4. Is that they would be cleansed. Now that point is that cleansing idea is introduced there in verse 4. And what's going to happen there in verse 4? The filth of the daughters of Zion. Now, when we think of filth, what do we think of? Awful dirty. Might say, oh, that's filthy. Got to clean it. But in this case, the text says that God's going to wash away the filth of the daughters of Zion. Can anyone remind me of those daughters of Zion are? Might include them. It's the women of Jerusalem, which would include the virgins, the young women. So God's going to clean them up, and what else is he going to do? Cleanse the bloodstains of Jerusalem. So we're running into more of this language that there was some bloodshed going on during this time. So, as a result, Isaiah says that these people were going to be cleansed by this spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning. Now, judgment and burning, they're parallel ideas, but in this case, it's a phrase that uses the image of spirits to make the point that God's people are going to suffer through judgment and burning. Well, why? To accomplish this cleansing that this verse is discussing. Questions or comments on verse 4? Yeah, it would be all inclusive of all the women. And again, the focus here is really on what's going on in Jerusalem. Yeah. So, I mean, the women are included. The women aren't innocent of some of the sins going on. The women were involved in some pretty terrible stuff as well, not just the men. But yeah, it's in the context of verse 1, so that's a good question. Anything else on verse 4? Okay. So verse 4 sets the stage for what's said in verse 5. Verse 4 made the point that God is going to do this cleansing, but then something else is going to happen. The text says in verse 5, "Then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night, for over all the glory will be a canopy." According to the language of that verse, what's going to happen after the cleansing of verse 4? What's that, Elaine? The Spirit of the Lord will hover over it. So, can anyone tell me some other things that this might refer back to in the Old Testament with the language of this verse? Out of Egypt. Yeah. Right. It's going back to that idea. Now, if we are tying this in with the Exodus things that we read about, the cloud by day, fire by night, what did that show with God doing that? He was with them. Even more, in addition to that, God was protecting them. So this cleansing from verse 4 is going to happen, but after that, God's going to protect his people. Put a canopy over them. Now, what's a canopy? It's a covering. It's a shelter, a protection. That's what this word has to do with, that it refers to. It's a shelter, protection, but it's applied here to say that the new thing God was going to create through the cleansing of verse 4, he's going to restore their protection. Now, before this point, one thing we've discussed before is that God removed his protection because of their sin. That's why all these enemies came in. Jeremiah, go ahead. I thought I saw your hand go up. Okay. So this cleansing would happen in verse 4, and what part of what that would accomplish is God protecting his people. That idea continues on into verse 6. Anything else on verse 5, though? Okay. So verse 6 continues the protection idea. Isaiah goes on to say that there would be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day, and refuge and protection from the storm and the rain. Again, this continues the idea of protection, but it emphasizes the fact that through the new thing, that God was going to create after the cleansing of verse 4, the people of Jerusalem would be protected. But it's using this imagery of being protected from heat by day and being protected from the storm and the rain. Again, this is not literal. People would still have to get hot. They'd still have to go through storms and the rains those bring literally. But this is imagery going to show that God would be protecting his people at all times. Questions or comments on verse 6? All right. But again, this is in that context of the remnant. So putting verses 4 through 6 together, the point we should see about the remnant is that they would be cleansed. They'd undergo a cleansing, and this cleansing would it's pictured in terms of burning. Purification is sometimes tied in with burning. But the result is that they'd be under God's protection once again. So what this should help us understand is that the cleansing of verse 4 would ultimately benefit God's people because it would restore them back to that relationship with God, which is one of protection in this particular case. So when we consider everything that we've looked at in verse 4, the point we should be left with is that there would be a remnant. This remnant would be called holy. This remnant would be cleansed. So again, what we should learn from these things that we must strive to be a part of God's remnant. Based on what we have studied in these verses, excuse me, God's remnant or people have been made holy by God. Furthermore, what Isaiah writes in this chapter also indicates that God's remnant or people have been cleansed by God. There are also people who are protected by God. But if we want to be a part of that remnant, what we must do is be in that relationship with Jesus, because it is through Jesus that we are made holy, we are cleansed, and protected by God. Again, this is just some application of this text to us. Any other questions or comments? All right. Dad, will you close us today?